This is just a visual of what the zones look like in the Buffalo Niagara area. It's the purple, purple shaded area. Thank you. So one thing to always keep in mind, if you've got a deal, you've got a project, double, triple check the census tract. Don't go off just a visual on the map. And the last thing you want to have is to arrange the stack and the financing, and you've got all the gaps covered, and the next thing you know, it was just off slightly in your SBLs, not in the zone. So always check that. This is just highlights of the program and the main benefits. That 10 to 15% discount, as Marnie referred to it, for investments held between 5 and 7 years. The big carrot is over 10 years, you get the appreciation in the investment tax-free. Okay, so here's an important point that gets lost, I think, in translation sometimes. You compare this Opportunity Zone equity investor, compare their investment and pool their funds and resources with traditional financing, for example, or any number of incentives that we've talked about today. But the incentive itself, the Opportunity Zone program, is only beneficial to someone with eligible gains to invest in the zone. And eligible gains is a defined term, but that's something to back up and keep in mind, that you have to have a capital gain that's generated to make this work for the investor to get the most out of it. And those capital gains can be both short-term and long-term. The capital gain has to be generated from a transaction with an unrelated party, so you can't create these artificial gains by self-dealing, so to speak, in order to avail yourself of the incentives. One of the huge timing issues is the 180-day requirement. So as an eligible, a holder of an investor with an eligible gain to invest has 180 days from the transaction that generated that gain to source it into a fund. Now that's a slightly different timeline if you've got a partnership scenario. So if I'm a partner, I have a flow-through interest, I get it on a K1 at the end of the year, and the partnership itself sold an asset that generated a gain. If the partnership does not make the election to defer that gain, myself as a flow-through beneficiary of an interest in the partnership, I can elect, therefore, to take my share of that partnership gain and invest it in a fund. But the nice thing about it being a partner and doing that is I don't have to do it from 180 days from the partnership's transaction that generated the gain. I can wait 180 days after the end of the partnership tax year. The only issue there is those K1s sometimes might get to the partner that's getting their paper gain and they see what they can invest. That K1 might not get to you in time or in a timely fashion to make that investment. So just keep that in mind as we're approaching year end and these transactions are starting to creep up on us in terms of the time frames. When you see red in this presentation, by the way, these are points I've added since the new regulations came out at the end of April. There's some clarifications and new points. So some of the red refers to those new clarifying points that came out in the second set of regulations. Okay. The new regulations talk about, or the second set of regulations talk about events causing inclusion of a deferred gain. So if you put your gain into the Opportunity Zone Fund, you're good to go, you're deferring it. There's certain events, and I'm not going to get into all of them, that the regs cover that will trigger the gain that you just tried to defer. For example, you transfer your interest in the fund as a gift and you think you're doing a good thing, that's going to trigger a gain. Transfer of an investment in a fund by reason of the taxpayer's death, however, they'll give you a break and that will not generate a gain. Okay, we talked about this judgment day on December 31st, 2026. That is a mandatory gain recognition date. And that refers to the gain, again, going back to that eligible gain that was invested in the fund. That date is going to be the date that you have to recognize the gain less the discount depending on how long you've been in the fund. Now, that's an important thing to recognize because there's going to be a liquidity event at that point in time, so you have to plan ahead for that. And what's nice in the new regs that just came out, you can have a debt refinancing at that point and use that in order to pay off some of the taxes, because that will create basis in the fund. So there's some opportunities there to restructure things so that you can pull cash out of the fund entity in order to cover those taxes. The fund itself is, there's no magic to it. It has to be a partnership or a corporation. Single member, disregarded LLCs won't qualify. You have to be taxed as a partnership or corporation. This is the vehicle within which the investor is going to put their money and to avail themselves of these tax incentives. Now, a lot of the nuances and the technical issues that arise that, as Marty discussed, if you've got a fund that's going to manage that process and cover all the bases in terms of making sure that the mix of properties qualifies, you don't have to worry about it, that's great. If you're creating your own fund, it's a closely held fund. These are things that you have to work with your advisors, your legal advisors, your financial advisors, your partners, to make sure that you are not running afoul of these rules. The fund has to maintain 90% of its assets in what's called qualified opportunity zone property. This is going to be a test, an average calculation. It's tested twice per year, last day of the first 6-month period, and then the amount of the fund property held on the last day of its year, tax year I should say. It's a form, it's self-reporting, so this is all self-reporting that the funds are going to do to the IRS to show that the fund qualifies and has the right mix of property. Your investment, or the investor's investment in the fund, has to be taken back in the form of equity. We've talked about that today. So investments must be, to qualify for the incentives, have to be cash or property, but not services. You can contribute appreciated property, okay? So if the land is needed for the deal, you can contribute that to the fund, but it's going to be treated as a mixed fund investment. So part of it will be able to count for the benefit, and part of it won't. So this just talks about interim gains and exit approach. If the property is sold for cash, it no longer qualifies for the 90% test, but what the regulations do say is if the fund sells some assets and then reinvests in another qualifying piece of property, that'll be okay as long as it happens within 12 months. So you as an investor, it's important to your investor client that that happens in a timely fashion, because you maintain your holding period and your investment still qualifies in the fund itself, even though there's some restructuring happening with the asset mix that the fund might hold. We talked about this self-certification. The form is 8996. If you go online, I have a screenshot of it here, it's available. The IRS anticipates revising the form for 2019 to require some additional information. You're probably going to have to disclose EIN and the amount invested. Right now, it's strictly focused on the property and then averaging that I was talking about to make sure you've got the right, you're meeting that 90% test. I foresee that in the future, this will evolve to a point where you're talking about job creation, what are the targets that you're hitting within the zone in terms of economic development goals, given that the program originally was intended to have that social impact that we've been talking about. I would anticipate between now and certainly 10 years out that this will evolve, but right now it's pretty bare bones. Now keep in mind that the entity that certifies itself as a fund, it can choose the month in the taxable year that it first becomes a fund. And why that's important is you can have an entity legally that was created that's sitting on a shelf, but it's not going to start acting as a fund until the month you so designate. And that will matter for purposes of your averaging so that you meet the 90% requirement, especially that first year. But just because your entity is formed, let's say, on day 1 of 2019 doesn't mean that that's the date it has to operate as a fund. The entity, there's some legal requirements in terms of, one of the questions I get asked is, well, I have this existing LLC, I have this existing corporation, can it just act as a fund? Technically, yes. However, there are requirements that the formation documents have to show that it was set up for purposes of investing in an opportunity zone and acting as a fund. So chances are your existing entity was not set up for that purpose. So it's just it's cleaner just to set something up in a new LLC, a new entity. Now here's a big point here: the penalties. So this 90% test that I've been talking about, the form that you're certifying that the property mix is being met. If the fund does not meet that 90% requirement, it's going to get penalized. That penalty is measured twice per year on those 2 test dates, and that matters because of how the structure of the fund is set up. So if the investor is investing in a fund, you're going to want to pay attention to who's managing the fund, what are the repercussions if there's penalties, are those passed through, is there more risk involved than just losing the investment, are we also subject to these penalties as an investor, do you absorb those in any fashion, or is it strictly kept at the entity level? So it's something to keep in mind. This is just the form that I was talking about, and these are the months and where you would disclose the total assets that the fund is holding. Okay. Now here's where it gets a little bit tricky. So the qualified opportunity zone property that you have to meet this 90% test, what is it? So the easiest way for the fund to meet the 90% requirement is to take back equity and own a second tier, lower level business, what's called in the form of stock or partnership interest. So the fund itself can do one of 3 things to meet that 90% test. It can own the property directly and have that 90% requirement met. So that's the first bullet point. Or it could own stock in a subsidiary business, and by virtue of holding that equity interest, that equity is what counts as the 90% requirement. And then the partnership, it would work with a partnership. So instead of taking stock, if you have a partnership interest that the fund owns part of a partnership, that partnership interest, boom, there you've met your 90% requirement. And why this is more advantageous, we'll get into in the next slide. Note that investments in other qualified funds don't qualify. Here's just a very bare bones approach. So you've got your fund, you've got your property, capital gains are invested, tax benefit to the investor. That is the 90% requirement where you've got direct ownership of the assets. The 2-tier approach that I'm talking about is, and again, this is a simplified version. You've got a single asset fund, or it's a flow through to a second tier entity, but there are much more complex structures or creative structures we can get into where there's co-managers and partnerships between the fund and a co-developer, for example, that Rich can talk about in terms of how this could be set up. But if you're just talking about the fund itself, now we're going through a subsidiary entity. You've got a partnership or a corporation. Now that the fund has invested in that business now has to meet a 70% requirement. So suddenly you have more flexibility with non-qualifying assets. So that gives the business a little bit of wiggle room where not every dollar is going to have to be spent in the zone necessarily. And so this allows for a little bit more flexibility by going through that second tier entity. So the partnership or the corporation, which is the qualified business that my fund is investing in, that's the entity that's going to acquire the property in the zone. This is just a definition of what is qualified opportunity zone business property, whether you're meeting the 90% test or whether you're at the lower level and you have to meet the 70% test through the business. It has to be acquired by the fund by purchase from an unrelated party after December 31st, 2017. Here's one of the other places we have a lot of confusion, or you can get tripped up. So you have these developers, or you have a prospective project where there's certain players already lining up a transaction, or they've got a deal in play, and they want to suddenly restructure it so that we can avail ourselves of the zone benefits because it's in a zone. The issue is if you're trying to buy and sell to yourself as a developer, for example, that may not work depending on what your ownership interest is in the property. That unrelated party rule is a 20% threshold. So if you have more than a 20% stake in the very property that you're trying to then sell to the fund, it may not work. So just keep that in mind. The original use, this was a big deal in the first set of regs. The IRS got a lot of comments, or the Treasury got a lot of comments on this. as to how can land ever have original use in the zone, for example, if the land was there before the zone was designated. Because one of the requirements is that original use of the property in the zone either begins with the fund, or the fund has to substantially improve the property. So one of the first questions everyone had is, what do we do with land? So now we know that land, whether it's improved or unimproved, it's excluded from the original use requirement. So that's a key change or clarification. Original use for purposes of property in general commences on the date it's placed in service in the zone. That's how they're going to define whether its original use is starting there. Now, here's where, well, I think when Bruce may have mentioned this, or one of the speakers, Buffalo may be in a slight advantage on this next point. Property that's been vacant at least 5 years qualifies for original use. So if you've got a vacant, underutilized building, suddenly it's more attractive because you don't, why that matters is you don't have to double down on the money you're putting in through the fund, because that building itself, either it's going to be original use property or you're going to have to substantially improve it. So I would rather have the option of having a vacant property and maybe doing my deal but not having to put as much in terms of my investment. It's got a little bit of a lower threshold in terms of what you have to meet for that investment to work. And then this is the other requirement. During substantially all of the fund's holding period, substantially all of the use of the properties in the zone. Those are a lot of references to the phrase substantially all. It means something different, slightly different in each context, so just keep that in mind if you ever see that phrase. When I use substantially all, what am I referring to? What percentage do I have to meet? Here, this is one of the big changes that I think is a huge, huge new point that's important. Leased property is now can qualify. So remember I said you have to acquire the property. Well, here, if you're a lessee, it put folks that were leasing property and doing tenant improvements at a disadvantage. Here you are putting all this work and effort into a zone property, but you're not the owner and you're not going to be able to have this deal qualify. This opens up a whole new world of opportunity. So improvements made by the lessee to that leased property now will satisfy the original use requirement, and it will be considered purchase and it will qualify. Same thing, has to be after December 31, 2017, and there's no requirement for that lessee to substantially improve. Just by virtue of doing those tenant improvements as a lessee, it's going to work. And the leased tangible property does not need to be acquired from an unrelated party. That's another big change. So remember I said you can't have the related party purchases. Now, if you're leasing the property, that could open up an opportunity to do so from a related party with some caveats, of course. There's always strings attached. Now, if you don't have original use, remember the other option is you can substantially improve the property. 30-month window to do that. So whether the fund's doing it or whether the qualified opportunities of business, the second-tier entity, is doing that, you have to substantially improve the property if it's not original use property. So what does that mean? Basically, you're doubling down on the basis. If you purchase a building on a land, the adjusted basis of the building is what we're talking about. You have to double that, essentially. Plus $1 was the example that George gave you. And the fund is not required to separately substantially improve the land. We talked about that. The land qualifies. Now, here's, I think, a problem, and something that was commented on in this last public hearing in July that still remains an issue with this calculation. Under the new proposed regs, some of the comments that have been received were, let's aggregate this calculation so that if you're doing a substantial improvement to, let's say you have a multiple building complex within the zone, look at what we're doing in the aggregate, look at all the total basis and what you're adding to the total project, and do the math. The Treasury said no. Under the new regs, the determination of substantial improvement is made on an asset-by-asset basis. So that just makes it harder, I think, to meet that requirement, because you may be putting all of your eggs in this basket and not doing a lot over here on this building because it doesn't need as much, and it's not going to work because you have to double down on both. I know I'm going really quickly, so if you need me to slow down or cover anything else, let me know. This is just a revenue ruling that came out in 2018 having to do with the substantial improvement test. It basically summarizes what we just talked about. Now remember, I talked about the fund can either buy the property or invest in the subsidiary. This is just the parameters regarding that. So I can do stock or I can take a partnership interest. That's the next slide. Okay, so if my fund doesn't purchase the property directly, but instead it invests in a qualified opportunity zone business, what are the rules there? So these are the definitions of what constitutes a qualified opportunity zone business. Substantially all, there's a phrase again, of the tangible property owned or leased is considered qualified opportunity zone business property. But here I only have to meet 70%, as we discussed. This next bullet point was a point of contention in the first round of regs. It has to derive at least 50% of its gross income from the active conduct of a trade or business in the zone. Well, the problem there is, what if you have a startup? What if you have a company that doesn't have revenues to show a history? How are we going to derive that gross income and show that it's in the zone? There was concern there that operating businesses would be disadvantaged here because it would be difficult to meet that requirement. But since that time, we've had a clarification in the regs that there are different safe harbors to meet that 50% test. You have to use a substantial portion of your intangibles in the zone. This last, second to last bullet point, the 5% tangible property can be than 5% of the property can be what's called non-qualified financial property. What does this mean? You can't just have your money flow through into this business and sit there. So the Treasury is saying less than 5% of the qualifying property can be cash and cash equivalents that are not being deployed. And that rule, however, has a safe harbor, and we'll talk about that, where the Treasury acknowledges you're going to have a timeline to use this money. It's not going to magically be deployed in an instantaneous fashion. So we have some wiggle room there and leeway that's afforded to us by virtue of this safe harbor. No sin businesses, no golf course, country club, massage parlor, hot tub facility, suntan facility, racetracks, gambling, and liquor stores are not eligible. Notice that cannabis and CBD businesses are not on that list, hemp not on the list. I would argue that hemp would probably be a safe bet since it's not on the schedule that cannabis is. However, I believe Treasury came out and said for the record they weren't trying to incentivize cannabis as an opportunity zone growth industry, so just keep that in mind even though it's not on the list.
So that's an exhaustive list, that's not like an example?
No, that's an exhaustive list, yep. So anything on
I don't know why I don't
hot tubs are not favored.
It says there are in New York State. It said liquor stores, the breweries and
Right, that would be okay. Liquor store, not okay.
I think the definition is consumption for on-premise versus off-premise. So you could, I think, write a submission to equivalent if they're doing, for the most part, less consumption on premise.
Take and go,
Yeah.
right, is the problem. So right, we want to take a closer look at that, especially in our state where we have a very robust craft beverage industry. There's this whole incentive program just built around that, and that's a very good point. So it would make sense to take a hard look at what is it that the industry is and what is it that the business is doing exactly. Non-qualified financial property limit. That was this 5% rule about the money that's subject to a working capital reserve. Here's the safe harbor. Okay, so this is interesting because we have little guidance on what this is going to look like. A lot of the questions I get are, what does my plan have to say? What are the rules around it? We don't know. So it must be a written plan designating funds as being held for the acquisition, construction, or substantial improvement of tangible property in the zone. Basically, the Treasury is saying, if you're going to keep the money and not deploy it, there better be a plan surrounding a timetable in which you're going to use it. As long as you're within that schedule, barring any unforeseen circumstances, you should be okay. Funds have to be in a manner that's consistent with that schedule. You can't go off topic or off timeline. And during that period that you're working within your plan, that money is going to count, and it's going to count for that 70% rule. Now, I say 70%, and here's a nuance where it gets tricky. This safe harbor with the written plan, it only applies to that subsidiary business. This safe harbor does not apply at the fund level. So if my fund is investing in a real estate deal directly, I don't have the benefit of this safe harbor, which is another reason you're going to see that two-tier structure very frequently. Now, first round, the safe harbor did not include operating businesses. It referred more towards traditional real estate development. Now we have a clarification that it will include development of a trade or business. So you have a business plan, basically. We talked about this, the safe harbor, it's 31 months. I can't recall if I said that. So it'll give you 31 months. If there's government delay, some zoning approval, for example, doesn't happen, that time that you're delayed by that governmental approval not happening will be tacked on the back end. So you have a little bit of leeway there. Because, I mean, they recognize that things happen in that world. The 50% gross income test. Remember we talked about you have to have active conduct of a trade or business, 50% of your revenue. This is the red bullet points here are the additional safe harbors that the service or the Treasury recognized to allow some flexibility to meet that test. So it can be met, the 50% gross income test can be met by either services performed based on hours in the zone, at least 50% of the services based on money paid for the services, let's say, or if you've got property that's not in a zone, but the management and the operational functions are located there, there's ways you can meet it. And then there's a catch-all also in terms of other facts and circumstances, which again, we haven't, those limits have not been tested yet. There's not a lot of guidance in there, but there's ways that you can get around it. We talked about the related party restrictions, very important. Both on the front end, the gain that you're using, and the purchase of the property that you're making. And then these are some key dates to remember. The December 2019 date this year is when you have to get in to get the 15% tax-free on your gain investment. By 2021, if you're in, you get 10%, so slightly less. The gain recognition date is the 2026 date, and then 2028, the designations of all opportunity zones will expire. That's the last day you can invest and receive 100% exemption on a fund interest on the appreciated value. But December 31, 2047 is the last date a taxpayer may make a basis step-up election. What that means is, even though the zone expiration date occurs in 2028, if you stay in the fund and continue holding that investment on the back end, even though it expired, you'll still be able to get the tax-free step-up in basis. This is just a council that was created. I thought it was interesting in terms of executive order in 2018, and it's basically harnessing all the incentives that are available, and they're tasked with developing a web-based tool for the programs. Here's some additional points in the new regulations. So one of the big things is we talked about the refinance proceeds in 2026. You can do them now. One of the big things that has come up is this idea that the fund or the business sells assets. What happens at the investor level? So the investor's not going to lose, as I said, the ability to step up its basis in the fund in year 11, let's say, just because the fund sold assets. However, there is no definitive answer as to whether the sale of the asset, even if it's reinvested, the proceeds are reinvested, if that asset appreciated at the subsidiary level, that gain will probably flow through up to the investor and create traditional ordinary income or gain that it has to recognize, because the gain on the sale of that asset is different than the investment in the fund. So just keep that in mind. You've got a couple different things going on there, whether you've got the assets being sold and reinvested or the fund interest itself being reinvested, which could also happen. That's one of the questions I get a lot. If you have an interest in a fund and you sell it, you sell your entire interest, you can reinvest in another fund. You'll have a new clock though. You don't get the holding period from your first investment, and you have 180 days to do that. And this last slide, we talked about that. We talked about that. We talked about about that, sorry. Oh, I'm going backwards, that's why it looks different. My last slide is where do we go from here? And that's been basically the subject of this whole conference. All of our conversations, who are your stakeholders, how do we market ourselves? I kept thinking Buffalo in the back of my mind. Why don't people nationally know that we love this place so much? So that's the message that has to get out, and it's very important that these clearinghouses, for lack of a better word, or these matchmaking portals are utilized, and these networks like we're developing here are developed and continue to have conversations, because that's where the matchmaking will occur. Because I completely agree with those comments that your traditional private equity, your hedge fund manager, they're not looking at Buffalo, they're not looking at Lackawanna, they're not looking at Tonawanda. So that's how we're going to get the local money here in these funds. That's it for my presentation.
I do, yeah, the slides for launch things. I don't know if there's any questions before I get going.
Oh yeah, probably do a couple now, sure.
Yeah.
I guess I'm a little bit confused. Are we basically saying that starting January 1st, 2022, there's no such thing as a qualified investment?
No, I'm not saying that, but starting January 1st, 2022, you would not be able to get a 15% discount on your capital gains. So there's three things going on here. My deferral, so just by virtue of deferring your capital gain tax, that's a good thing, right? Time value of money, just by kicking the can, that's a benefit. Second thing is your discount. You can either get 10 or 15% off your tax bill in 2026. If I wait till 2022, I'm not going to get any discount. I'll pay the full tax on my gain in 2026. And the third thing is when I exit the fund, if I've been in there at least 10 years, the appreciation in my investment will now be tax-free. And that's, that has no limit potentially. That benefit continues, correct. But you have to make the election to defer your capital gain before the zones expire. So you can't wait indefinitely. There's still an outside window for that. But these next few years are the big years for purposes of getting that tax discount in 2026.
Are you implying that 10% of the assets of the fund can be made outside of the zone?
Correct. If the fund is investing directly.
And in terms of risk, how comfortable do you think investors would be with pushing close to that 10%?
I wouldn't recommend it. There's just too many, because remember, everything I just talked about these are all draft regulations. So you can rely on them. The IRS told us that we can rely on it. The piece that you cannot rely on is the guidance I referred to with the assets. If you've got a multi-asset qualified opportunity zone fund that starts selling assets, whatever the impact is going to be to the investor at the top level, there's some guidance out there right now. The IRS said we cannot rely on that. So there's a lot of risk right now potentially, which is why folks are holding back and not taking that, pulling the trigger on this stuff. And why add another level of risk just by virtue of getting really close to that 90% or 10% threshold? There's enough unknown out there with this program.
Just a point of clarification. So you may have answered, I may have missed it. At the end of the 10-year period, you have to close the fund, or can you keep it rolling?
No, you can keep it rolling. What'll happen is on the accounting for your, let's say you're the investor, you now have a step up in basis of your initial investment to fair market value, lesser of. So here's another interesting point. Everything is at risk, right? These aren't FDIC guaranteed investments. It's a traditional equity investment. So your investment is at risk. You have to keep that in mind as an investor. But I look at it this way. It's at risk, yes, but let's say in 2026 when that judgment day happens, so to speak, you're not going to have to pay tax on the full initial investment if it dropped way down and you lost all your money in the business. You won't have to pay tax on your original investment. It's whatever it's worth at that point. But the upside is the opposite, the contrary. If it increases in value significantly, that upside is all tax-free, but you can continue to stay in the fund.
So, what I'm getting at is if I keep this going for 30 years and I leave my money invested in there, does it keep generating tax-free revenue?
Well, it's not tax-free revenue, it's the appreciation in the value of your investment. So remember what I said, if traditional like operation of the business, or if there's a sale and gain, whatever the business is doing, you're gonna have a plan for that, because you will be generating taxable income at that point. It's the interest, the investment. So your traditional partnership taxation rules, or your interest in the corporation, whatever your dividends would be, all of that still applies. The difference is when you pull out of that and sell your interest in the fund, that's where your tax benefit really accrues, because that is going to come out tax-free. But as it's operating down, throughout those years, you're going to still have to pay tax on the day-to-day operations, or if it runs a profit, if it's an operating business, for example, and you take a share in that, you owe tax on that. Larry?
What happens at the end? What happens if the business that's invested in goes out of business?
So then your value, the question was what happens if your business you invested in goes out of business or depreciates. So that was my point depending on how long you've been in it, right? If you're past the 10-year mark, you're not going, in 2026, if it loses its value at that point and you're in the fund, you're not, whatever your value is, it would have also depreciated, your value, of your investment in the fund. At that point, you're going to owe a lot less tax than you would have on your initial gain recognition date that was deferred. So you will get the benefit of that depreciation in the sense that you won't owe tax on the value of your fund at that point. And if it decides to unwind, that's an option too. What'll be interesting to see is what happens 10 years into all these funds, right? In the next 10, 11 years, is there going to be a market for these fund interests? Is there going to be this mass pullout or restructuring of these funds? That begs the question of what will the market look like? Obviously, we don't know at this point, but it's an interesting question in terms of the valuation, the future valuation of what these interests will be.
Thank you, Patty.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Richard Rogers. I'm a tax credit attorney primarily. I also have a consulting business that does urban planning and economic development consulting. But we just started another business called Common Owner that's designed to deal with a lot of the implementation of the Opportunity Zone program and also tax credit investing. So, the goal there is dealing through some of the securities issues and having a way that more people will have access both to these investment opportunities and to raising capital on the developer side. So, just a little bit what I want to talk about, go through the local conditions, and then kind of how those local conditions square up with this program and how we may actually be able to get some deals done. So first of all, there's a lot of kind of fanfare for Buffalo today, and I think the resurgence has been nothing short of amazing. However, you need to consider that most real estate deals in upstate cities, Buffalo, Rochester, are still heavily subsidized typically. Traditionally through various tax credit mechanisms, grants, tax abatements, etc. This kind of charts Buffalo compared to some other municipalities and the issues of getting deals done in Rust Belt cities. You don't typically have the same rents that you would see in larger markets. There's less capital locally. So I want to talk a little bit about tax credits, since that's primarily what I deal with, and how they can help an equity stack. The opportunity zones, you hear a lot that it won't make a bad deal into a good deal, right? Tax credits do have some aspect of that. They kind of really take the market return out of a deal and can bring capital in solely in exchange for the tax credits. So, they really do, especially in the low-income housing tax credit context, make deals that wouldn't otherwise work viable. So, some common tax credits that you see in New York, certainly historic tax credits have been huge, brownfield tax credits, and now Now, some of these are refundable, and some of them are capped, and you have to apply for competitively. Some vary by state, but many states do have a historic tax credit program. Some states have a brownfield program. Low-income housing tax credits are federal, although the rules kind of vary by state. So you have different situations and different structures for each one, but each one will essentially bring capital, very direct kind of subsidy into a deal, although sometimes at a discount. So an example of how historic tax credits could work is, essentially you'll syndicate the tax credits because your developer won't be able to use the tax credits because they have depreciation and other kind of passive activity rules prevent the developer from using them. So they'll bring an investor in specifically for that purpose. That investor will contribute capital, stay in the deal typically for 5 or 6 years, and then exit the deal. That capital is sometimes used to pay up for, 30 to 50% of development costs. So in this example, you look at the capital generated by the historic tax credits, and it'll pay for a good amount of your soft costs, your acquisition, and your development fee. Some issues with that is that it doesn't all come in at once. Typically, historic tax credit capital will come in 20% when the investor is admitted, and that's because of Treasury regulations that require that. But the bulk of the capital for the credits is going to come in at permanent loan conversion. So once the project is placed in service, the construction loan is converted to a permanent loan, and at that time, the investor is contributing the balance of the capital. This is kind of the simple legal structure that you would use for a historic tax credit situation during the first 5 years. The credits need to follow the profit and loss interest in the partnership. So the HTC investor will come in for 99%, and then you'll set up a developer fee that will allow the cash flow to get back to the developer and their local investors in this slide. Now, what you would see in the opportunity fund context, I would suggest would be instead of local investors, you would have the opportunity fund. Here, this is a bit of a more complicated structure, but same idea. Where the local investors are, you have an opportunity zone investor, opportunity fund, invest in the landlord entity. You have a master lease with a tax election to pass the credits along the structure to the HTC investor. After 6 years, the lease structure is collapsed, and now your local investor or your opportunity zone fund owns maybe half of the deal, and your project developer owns the other half of the deal. Now, unlike tax credits, where the return and the investment is kind of isolated, your opportunity fund investors will expect a strong return, or at least a competitive return. So, one of the questions we have is, how does Buffalo compete nationally? With projects across the country where there's going to be a lot more appreciation, a lot more upside. By investing in these types of deals, there are structures where effectively that investment is bridging the gap between construction financing and permanent financing. When the tax credits come in, you can generate relatively high returns. The thing is, that's the lucrative part of these deals. It's the lucrative part of the process. The actual cash flow is okay, right? So you would have to repeat this process over and over again. So this kind of shows, this demonstrates that at construction, you have a gap here. If you add up the bottom 2 lines, of about $1 million in this deal. And this is a heavily subsidized deal. This is a real deal that had a grant, a significant state grant. Was looking for new market tax credits to try to balance out the deal. So you had a lot going on. And even after having a bridge loan, you still need $1 million. Where does it come from? And that's where I think the qualified opportunity fund equity can come in and be really useful in these deals. And then when the loan converts, you see zeros on the bottom 2 lines because the qualified opportunity fund and the developer get all of their capital back. The timing for that varies depending on the deal size, but you can look at about 18 months from construction financing to permanent conversion. Now, when the capital comes back to the fund, as we've kind of discussed, it can't go back to the investors without creating an inclusion event. So what's really key here is that the fund would then need to invest in a second deal. By doing so, you can maintain these higher rates of returns over and over again. And very importantly, the fund has liquidity to make a special tax allocation in 2026 without the need to force a project refinancing, which is a pretty big issue right now in this space. So you see here, the Opportunity Fund investor contributes in 2020, $830,000. By 2022, the project's placed in service, and they're getting about $980,000 back in this case. Again, this is a very heavily subsidized deal. It's not always that good, but the goal would be to get at least 75% of the capital back at that time and allow the fund to reinvest. What that also does is allows for, when the capital comes back, it allows for the fund to diversify its assets into multiple projects in a way that you're not going to see with these single asset funds. And I think that's really important because some of the assets may appreciate, other ones may not, but it really improves the chances. So the SEC actually released a statement a couple of days ago on opportunity funds and really clarifying that these are securities that people who are promoting funds, who are finding investors for funds and charging fees are broker-dealers. So people need to be very, very careful about this. And so that's something that we're working on right now, is setting up a portal, not like some of the other portals that you may have heard of where you're just kind of informally connecting people, but really following the securities regulations and being able to host offerings, kind of similar to what Launch New York is doing, but more on the real estate side. So some challenges though, particularly with smaller deals, in getting capital into smaller deals, which I think should be the goal of this program, or one of the goals of this program, is that these securities offerings are very expensive. You can expect to spend up to $20,000 for what's called a 506C offering, which is then limited to accredited investors. Crowdfunding offerings can be a bit cheaper, but are still a lot of paperwork, a lot of compliance type of situations. So typically what you'll see is this Rule 506B, where essentially you have to have this pre-existing relationship, and that's where I think some of the conversation about developers coming with their investors makes a lot of sense. But we would really like to move beyond that and get more people involved in this process, both on the developer side and the investor side, so you don't, have to have your uncle, who's your opportunity fund investor, go down to the Buffalo Club, right? You can actually reach out and engage people in a lot more kind of transparent process. So this is not an opportunity fund deal, but it gets to that last point I was making about opening the process up. So this was a project that we worked on the law side, and there's a little cafe in a historic building down in Springville, New York, where a very, very dedicated project sponsor is looking to raise capital, essentially syndicating the tax credits by crowdfunding them. So he didn't go through one of those processes I just mentioned. He did an intrastate offering. So all of the investors have to be New York State residents. They have to, show proof of residence in New York, and then they can invest, based on their appetite, based on their ability to use the credits. Some challenges here are passive activity restrictions, make it kind of difficult for some people to use the credits. They need to talk to their tax advisor. Not everyone has a tax advisor. So, you do get into some logistical challenges here. Also, with this type of offering, you have to go back to the Attorney General's office and amend your statement, telling exactly how you're going to solicit and when. So it's highly, highly regulated. But I think the structure generally is something that we're looking for to really open the doors here for people to invest, whether it's historic tax credits or opportunity zone benefits. So this is for that offering, $300,000, and without an absolute mountain of work by the project sponsor, this project would not have happened. and I think some, very friendly kind of professional fees and stuff like that. So we are looking for a way to make this model more scalable, and that's what we're working on right now. So this is the strategy that we outlined for what could be a really great qualified opportunity fund that would be very lucrative and nationally competitive. So, in 2019, you do your first deal, historic tax credit deal. By 2021, we had that chart earlier, the capital can come back to the fund level, and then the fund can reinvest that capital in another deal that is ready to go, as Pietro mentioned. The regs do permit a 1-year time period for the fund to reinvest the proceeds from a return of capital. And then it could do so even potentially once more in 2024 if everything goes according to plan. If not, you would still have enough of a return of capital. Let's say you do only 2 deals, that there is cash, there is liquidity available to pay those 2026 tax distributions. And that's something that's really key. We've had people reaching out to us, Pittsburgh, Louisiana, really across the country, because they're looking for a way to be able to pay those tax distributions without forcing a refi on the project that may or may not be able to support it. So right now, something that we're putting together is a Western New York Opportunity Fund, kind of similar to the model that we have in Batavia. We would look to raise $4 to $5 million to invest in several historic tax credit deals and really put that model to work. Also, deals that are pursuing new market tax credits that works really well. Lenny had left, but his question earlier about LITAX, doesn't really work as well with that model. The way that the legal structure is for low-income housing tax credits doesn't really permit this sort of approach. But we are hoping to launch this by the end of the year. It is a little challenging and tricky, just making sure the several projects we're looking at are all in the same time frame. But we are working on that now. So that's my presentation. I'll turn it over to Alex. Any questions?
I have one.
Sure.
So I just want to reconcile what I heard Pedro talk about and your comments about this, because the HTC fund seems to be generating income. Are you saying that they can generate the income every year, and that's a high return, but that's not sheltered, but they still got the benefit deferral at the beginning? Or by accumulating it in the way you're doing it, are they able actually to defer all the returns until after the 10-year period?
So they're not recognizing capital gain on any of these investments until year 10. None of the underlying assets will be sold. For the first several years, the equity comes out, but there isn't really a lot of cash flow. There is some cash flow, and they would pay ordinary income tax on that under partnership tax law, like we discussed.
I think the point, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying that the return of capital you're building and that liquidity, so that, and then restructuring it and reinvesting in 2 years. And there was a limit. There's a reason why you have to wait 2 years. Did you touch on that?
As far as for the capital to come back?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, so that's kind of the gap between the construction and permanent financing, right? So, that's while the building is under construction. So a lot of these subsidies don't come in, grants, tax credit, equity, stuff like that, doesn't come in until the project is complete, at which point you do have an excess, essentially, amount of equity in the deal that can be distributed out to the partners, one of which being the Opportunity Fund. So it pulls the cash back, it's a return of capital, then turns around and reinvests it. I'm not sure if I answered your question. Okay. Okay, cool. Steve?
You said high, rates of return. The example you gave was 22%. What do you mean by high levels?
Yeah, I think our target is, anywhere, really the target is to get over 15% leverage. But that deal in particular like I pointed out, had a lot of subsidies in the capital stack and the sources and uses. So, a typical deal, there's another one we're modeling right now that's around an 8% return. Those returns, though, don't attempt to quantify the capital gains benefits, any of the Opportunity Fund benefits. So those are just purely the real estate return, whether it was an Opportunity Zone deal or not.
So So for banks that have, capital gains that they're looking to shelter, is there a CRA
So
for those?
typically banks won't have capital gains. Almost never, right? It's in the 500 section of the CFR. I'm not super familiar with it, but essentially what allows them to operate as banks is that they don't recognize capital gains as capital gains. Instead, they recognize it as ordinary income, essentially, or some sort of special income where it isn't classified as capital gains. It may be possible in like a foreclosure situation if they foreclosed on some assets and then those assets appreciated, but that would be a pretty rare circumstance, I would say. But CRA benefits are helpful other ways, right? In these deals.
In the traditional sense, you're not necessarily going to get the benefit of the sheltering of the capital gains. There's no gain to shelter, but you're still deploying funds into these areas that we
Banks
call.
have been very active in my time, but I heard that there were some banks that were actually looking at.
Yeah. Well, so certain banks, especially very large banks, right, that have an investment arm, or really a separate entity that does this kind of, they have various investment entities set up that aren't really banks. They're more like, they're almost like private equity funds, I guess, that would, so they may be affiliated with a bank or something like that, but maybe a little different.
I have one, just curious about structuring. So it seems like there's kind of an overarching opportunity fund entity. I know you have the 12 months to reinvest, but isn't any excess capital gains there trigger the tax effect unless you took it and invested it into a new opportunity fund that did a new investment? It would be able to be held underneath. You'd have to pay whatever appreciation there was on.
At the time, yeah.
Yes, so you would structure it to not have inclusion events, right? That's the concern, is that any excess, in excess of your basis, your zero basis, right? It's an inclusion event. In this model, and perhaps I should have clarified a bit better, but you don't have any money coming out to the investors, right? Similar, like for any of these, I would suggest you really don't want cash leaving the fund to go to the investor level. What we're talking about is the money coming out of the qualified opportunity zone business to the fund, and then the fund turning around and investing it in project number 2, let's say.
Right. I could be misinterpreting this, but I thought anything over what your initial investment is, if it's less than 10 years, even though it's not a capital flow to partners, would be taxed as a capital gain at that point.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. So then you'd have to take that capital, even if you reinvested it through that same fund, you'd have to pay the tax portion of a separate opportunity fund.
That would be more of a distribution as opposed to a return of capital, right? So anything, you're right, anything in excess of your basis that comes out.
In your model, it's never crossed
There's
the
no
threshold.
distribution, right?
Yeah, it's
Which I
a
think goes back to
return of
Kevin's
capital.
point that there's no distribution.
It's just a return of capital. Okay. And then as far as the cash that you have within the entity to pay off the tax, or the cash available to pay off the tax in 2026, where is that being held? How is it not?
So you would need you would have to have, again, a return of capital, right? That comes in at some point. It would have to come out in 2025, right? To keep you within that 1-year window. And that's something we're still working through the regs and the final details, but there should be, in the same way that there's a return of capital when the tax credit equity comes in at permanent conversion, and you can have this return of capital to the fund, rather than then investing in a third project, you could use a portion of that to get up to the investor level, make a special tax distribution for them to pay those.
You're still, in that case, you're still just staying underneath what is the sorry, just having a conversation here. So I get it. So I guess where all my questions lie, and I'll kind of summarize it, was in that structure, because you're not returning capital above what you contributed, it's not actually triggering any cash event, any capital event. And then it's just at the end, when everything is basically sold, where then you have some substantial appreciation from what your investment was, then the capital gains taxes.
Yeah, so, ideally you have, the fund has an interest in 2 or 3 project partnerships, right? And then that third one, the capital comes into the third project in 2025, it's returned again to the fund. A portion of that is made as a special tax distribution to the investors so they can pay that tax, and then perhaps the balance of it is reinvested either into the existing businesses or into a fourth project.
Okay, and then the other thing I'll just bring up, just because it's something that we've encountered in our discussion, is that while there's a diversification benefit that I think is really unique about that structure that has been hard for others to figure out the timing of, obviously you're still trying to line up the projects, which I'm sure is just something that you have to do, but selling at the end, right? Because it's if you sell the underlying assets underneath the fund level, it could trigger hot assets where there's depreciation recapture, versus if you can sell the full fund interest, which would be convincing somebody to buy your interest in effectively 3 businesses, 2 real estate properties, whatever it is, then you wouldn't have that concern, but it's obviously more complicated.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think, everyone's concern right now is the exit. And to Pietro's point, if you have a flood of these kind of upper tier assets on the market, what does that do? But again, to Joe's question, you don't have to sell, right? You can hold until 2040 something, right? So, perhaps there is a dip there, but then it picks back up. There's plenty of time to coordinate those exits. Also, in the real estate context, you do have things like REITs that may be looking for those types of, asset classes.
Ted, I don't know if you're going to talk about this, but thanks.
Turn it off.
All right. So, all right, there we go. So, I'm glad we're talking about this, and frankly, if we look around the room, all of us can sit and have a rather complicated conversation on this. My concern in dealing with these neighborhoods, and Rich, I know you deal with them, and Alex, I know you're familiar with them as well, is when you deal with LITEC and SLIC, it's affordable housing, it's pretty vanilla. These neighborhoods around us might not understand the math behind the deal, but they understand they're getting affordable housing. When I work with the community leaders, and then we talk about opportunity zones, and you're working in their neighborhoods, but it's kind of separate. So, and it's difficult to bring these individuals into these deals due to the securities laws. So how do we reconcile the need to be sensitive to the community, to engage them in this process, educate and what have you, but the fact is that most individuals are not going to be able to participate due to securities laws. So how do we deal with this?
Well, so that's why we're investing all of our time and money in setting up a crowdfunding portal for anyone to be able to invest. So the way that works, and I didn't really go through the regs there, but based on your net worth or your income, you're allowed to invest certain amounts, but anyone can invest $2,000 a year. So, within the Qualified Opportunity Zone business, conducting an offering, maybe that's 20% or 25% of the project, and the developers conducting that offering first, and then the Opportunity Zone fund gets capitalized and it comes in, but now you have potentially people from the neighborhood, people from the city who aren't accredited investors, who own 25% of this project, so that when the large amount of HTC capital or really any subsidy, new market, grant, OpZone capital comes in, you already have people bought into the program. So figuring out ways for projects to absorb those costs are things that we're working on now. But I do think it's possible once we have this crowdfunding platform set up.
So that's great.
So we have about 40 minutes left, and this actually.
I'll try to be short because Alex is much more interesting than I am.
But I think, it was decidedly wonky stuff. So we knew we'd go deep, but I did want to just give a time check.
Okay. Well, I want to thank the 2 last presenters. I thought it was very enjoyable and interesting and clear, which is very difficult in this space. And I love Rich's last thoughts about actually allowing the community to invest and have a stake in their own community. I just think it's one of the most exciting things I've heard here, and I've heard so many exciting things. I don't want to forget to thank LISC, not just for the conference, but in the thing we're going to present throughout this process, LISC has been a very helpful sounding board, talking to them about ideas, having them say, Ted, you better look at this, watch out for that. Well, that's actually interesting. So I want to thank Richard Manson and the folks at LISC, especially for that. I also want to acknowledge this is a project, a joint initiative that wouldn't be possible without Hudson River Housing, which is a nonprofit agency in the Poughkeepsie area, the community foundations of Hudson Valley, who, as I mentioned, have been very instrumental in connecting us to investors and also thinking through the legal issues. And you were talking about pro bono legal work. The 506C we did, including all the development work for this project, was a lot more than $20,000 of pro bono work from Schiff Hart, who is a law firm in Chicago. So I just want to acknowledge all those people. And then also make sure this is not an offering. The problem that brought me to this, and I think brought all the parties that I mentioned, and I should probably add also prudent investors with an orientation to also have positive social impact. I would distinguish that from necessary social investors who sometimes aren't so worried about returns. These are people who wanted to get a fair return, but wanted to do something good in the community. So the problem you're all struggling with is that opportunity zones are this great thing. They're going to bring capital to communities that haven't had capital before. And that's been unfair. So we want to do that because that's going to uplift the community, it's going to uplift the local economy, it's going to create jobs, it's all going to be great. Okay? Now, I have a cousin who lived in Buffalo, and he lived on Elmwood Avenue, and I was talking to him about the Renaissance of Buffalo a couple of years ago. And he said, yeah, it's great for some people. And I said, well, what do you mean? I said, I mean, look at all the activity. He goes, yeah, but I can't afford my apartment. So he had to move out because of the benefits that we're actually trying to create here. So what's I think really bothered us is that we can do all these good things, but if we displace the people who live here, if they can't afford to live in those communities anymore, then have we really accomplished what we wanted to do? And one of the key things about these rules, you went through very nicely, eligible capital gains. Last time I checked, most people who have large capital gains to reinvest tend to be rich. So, you know, how do we make sure that some of these benefits go to the people who actually live in the communities? So what we did was to try to create a structure, and we tried it with lots of different devices, and it kind of ended up in opportunity zones because it seemed to work. And what this structure does is quite simply, it gives, for every $60,000 of equity that generous investors give us, together with $120,000 to $140,000 of debt, which we get from kind of an unusual place, which is also some of social investors. That money allows 2 people to get affordable housing for 10 years. And at the end of 10 years, one of those people gets to buy the property at an affordable mortgage cost and at a price that's $30,000 below the original cost of buying and building that property. The other tenant, who doesn't get that opportunity, gets a $4,200 reward for being there, and is actually the backup buyer if the first tenant doesn't buy, and then also gets 10 more years of affordable housing. So this all accomplishes Hudson River Housing's mission orientation, the things they're trying to do for their community, and in particular it does the thing we're trying to do for the people who actually live there in a way that generates what I would call satisfactory returns to investors. Let me show you the structure, and then I'll talk briefly about the returns, because they're a little bit different from what other people are talking about there, but I still think they're out there. So, in the first column is basically the site is acquired. It actually is acquired with the Opportunity Zone funds, so the funds get put to work within the 6-month requirements that everyone was talking about. Then the property is built. That's built with debt. That debt actually comes from donor-advised funds of the community foundation. So people who are already in the community, care about the community, want to see positive results, get, in this model, a 4% return. It's not extraordinary, but its debt, the cash flow coverage is 1.2 to 1.4 times. That return is higher than treasuries. Won't deny there's risk in it. It pays off, as you can see in the structure, over 10 years. Now, that debt, which is 2/3 of the capital stack, it may seem strange that it pays off in 10 years, but one of the reasons that's possible is that the Class A units, which are Opportunity Zone money, is invested entirely in essentially the future interest in the property in 10 years with no current return. So all of the cash flow is going to pay down the debt more quickly. That also makes the transaction much more secure for everyone. And I want to again acknowledge Hudson River Housing's role in this, because one of the things they've done is to take their management fee and make it contingent. So that if there's not enough cash flow, if a tenant's not paying on time or something of that sort, so there's not enough money to pay the notes, then they step back and don't take that money until they're able to collect it. I want to stress, some people think of affordable housing as being risky, and there are certainly risks involved in it. Here we're dealing with 80% of AMI tenants. But because the rent is lower than market rents, if someone doesn't pay, goes on their way, there are issues with people going on their way promptly, recognize that. But if someone doesn't pay and goes on their way, there's someone else who wants to be in that apartment or that house right away. Also, Hudson River Housing is very important for a couple of reasons that, again, LISC has stressed to us. One is they're very much in the community. They already have 400 people on a waiting list who want to be able to buy a house. They have relationships with those 400 because they're in a training process of training them for homeownership to understand the budgeting and financial issues and responsibilities of homeownership. So those are all things that actually make the project work. The other thing is that over time, they have the experience and the expertise to actually maintain the properties and maintain a relationship with the tenant. So the tenant has a mindset of not, I'm a tenant, and this is just the place I live, but this is the home that I really own. And in fact, they have a contractual right from day one to buy it in 10 years if they make it through that lease period. It's also interesting to think about it. There's actually less risk for the tenant, because if you, than taking out a mortgage today. If I took out a mortgage, one for 100% financing cost, so it wouldn't be very prudent to begin with, but if I did that and I default in year 3, then I have a problem because I'm on the mortgage. In this situation, if the tenant, because of some financial calamity, is unable to continue to pay rent, they have a problem because they have to find new housing. But they don't have anybody pursuing them for the money they owe or things of that sort. So there's actually a little bit less risk for the tenant during the 10-year period, but they're still building real equity. When you get to year 10, at that point, the Opportunity Zone investors are looking to be paid back. They're not actually that anxious about it. But one of the things that LISC stressed to us is the sooner the tenant can become an owner, the more interest they have now. There's a program that's been done in Cleveland, and one of its problems is in trying to comply with 15-year requirements for LISC. The tenants sitting there going, it's 15 years before I actually get anything. So shortening that period is important. We've actually built into our program a 5-year point, where at year 5, there's actually a process where the person, tenant, gets slightly differently framed right to own in another 5 years. So it's sort of it's a point in time where they feel they're even closer to real ownership. And again, that seems to be a very helpful kind of step to make the owner feel they're getting closer and closer to being the actual owner of the property. So in year 10, I don't want to get too wonky here, but structurally, the preferred holders do not have a right to put their units to someone else and force them to buy. The Opportunity Zone investors. However, the cost, the redemption price of the Opportunity Zone investment is 55% of the original cost. So it's reasonable for Hudson River Housing to want to purchase that. When Hudson River Housing purchases it in the next column at 55%, Hudson River Housing turns around and sells the units to the tenant at 83% of the original price. So Hudson River Housing has every incentive to do that. And that, of course, is below the original cost. Structurally, because of some of the requirements that you both talked about, it's important that it's done in that order. This is an equity interest. It's not a debt instrument. It looks a lot like a debt instrument in returns, but it's not. And secondly, it doesn't really, the tenant has an unconditional right to buy at that price. If Hudson River Housing chooses for some reason not to exercise its option, the tenant has the right to buy it from the Opportunity Zone investor. So you've tried to complete that circle. But structurally, the thing Pietro talked about, you don't want to sell the underlying asset. You want to have the Opportunity Zone investment units acquired and redeemed at the higher price. So that's my wonky presentation on what we've been doing. If I have any questions, very briefly, then turn it over now. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. Very cool model, something that I got to see from inception last year, and how it's progressed is fantastic. So it was very exciting to see that. So I will get going here. I know we only have about 20 minutes, so I'm going to kind of breeze through a little bit on the background of launch, because Marty did a fantastic job of explaining that. I think the clicker, I guess I'll just stand up too. We'll get out of there. So as Marty mentioned, I think everybody in the room is here, but Launch New York is really tackling what we like to refer to as a three-legged stool. So upstate New York has fantastic innovation, denoted by that light bulb. But what I think makes us different from other areas, think it, Boston, Austin, Silicon Valley, more developed entrepreneurial ecosystems, is we lack risk capital and talent. So Launch New York is a venture development organization, largely based off of other programs in Pennsylvania and Ohio. And what we're here for is to provide pro bono mentorship, so that's the talent piece, to high growth potential startups in the 27 westernmost counties of New York State, so think Buffalo to Binghamton. And then the other piece is risk capital. So we're trying to make sure that these companies that have this great innovation and now have mentors are staying within the region and are able to grow within the region and create jobs. So as I mentioned, we are from Buffalo to Binghamton. We're in that green shaded area. So we are a 501c3 venture development organization. For those that are curious, in Pennsylvania, it is the Ben Franklin Technology Partners, and Ohio is, I believe, Third Frontier, but Jumpstart is probably more well known. We are a community development financial institution, so we're one of only 17 CDFIs in the country providing equity capital to companies, and we are the only one in New York State that is offering that. What's been very exciting about that specifically, I'd say it's a double-edged sword. One, it was concerning to find out that we naturally met the requirements for a CDFI, being that over 70% of our clients and portfolio companies are in low-income census tracts. The positive side to that is we've been able to now have 2 awards directly from Treasury that have gone right into companies for investment. So we're excited that we've been able to pull up some dollars from the federal government to our region. So this is, and I'll stop the slides after this, I believe. I just wanted to touch base on some of the other awesome things going on. We did officially just surpass 1,000 clients, so this is out of date since when I shared the document, which is since 2012. So we've worked with, on the mentorship side, over 1,000 clients since 2012. As I mentioned, 70% are in low-income neighborhoods or low-income census tracts. We have deployed out of our seed fund since 2016. It's about $2.1 million now into 42 companies. It's about 65 transactions. We recently, our first actual dollars from New York State, which is through NYSERDA, the Energy Authority. We are one of 6 clean tech incubators. So that allows us to provide an extra, call it 50% resources on the mentorship side to companies that are in the clean tech arena. They also have access through us to non-dilutive grants through NYSERDA, as well as some other very exciting programs and events that they can attend. I think one of the really important things that hasn't been necessarily something we directly focused on, but just a function of the fact that we are a women-led organization. We have a women-led fund manager, and we're not really affiliated with any specific group. We've been able to obtain 33% women-led businesses and almost a quarter-led minority-led businesses. Again, not something that we actively push towards, but is something that we plan to do in the future to try and actually increase those numbers even more, though they are, I would say, much better than national averages. And I believe that is it with contact information. So I'll just stay on this slide as I kind of talk about what we're doing now and where we're going. So as I mentioned, we have invested in 42 companies out of our nonprofit fund. That is largely donation-based, and I have to mention, I don't even know if any of them are still here, but the Wilson Foundation is one of our biggest funders in that nonprofit fund. We recently, as of this year, launched our first for-profit vehicles, the first being a limited partner fund, which co-invests alongside that nonprofit fund, and then our investor network, which we had just launched about 2 weeks ago. So I'll touch back on that in a minute, because that's where Opportunity Zones come into play. I know that's why you're all here, but just a quick overview of kind of our process. So companies come in, they can apply to us. We have about 6 intake calls every week. Those are often full. We will take on any client who has a footprint within our region that is a high growth potential business and is willing to be coached. We define high growth potential as $10 million in top line revenue within 5 to 7 years forecast. We also want those companies to grow through equity capital and have an exit in mind. If they do not meet that criteria when they come in, we'll just direct them to other resources within the community. Those companies are then assigned an entrepreneur in residence, which is a mentor. We have about 27 of those across our footprint, as you saw in that green shaded area. They are contractors with us, so we actually pay our mentors, but none of that is charged to the clients that are being provided that service. After about a minimum of 3 months, oftentimes longer than that, companies can apply to our seed fund. The entrepreneur in residence has to give the thumbs up, and they send us their executive summary, their pitch deck, their capitalization table, and their business model canvas, which is what we use as part of our tools for mentoring. That is all compiled. There's a leadership assessment that we'll send them through. We open those windows every 2 to 3 months, and we'll get about 15 to 20 companies that will apply. About 2/3 of those will then move into a full due diligence. That due diligence is everything you would expect a venture capital firm to do. So we're requesting operating agreements, financial forecast, IP-related information, resumes, you name it. It's a pretty big package. Part of this whole process, or one of the motivations for this process, is actually to get these companies investment ready. So most investors, when they want to see a company's due diligence files, if it takes them longer than 48 hours, they're probably going to lose interest. So we're, through our process, making sure these companies have their digital files in order and they're prepared for when that investor comes so that they do become investor ready. All those due diligence files are then combined into our internal investment memo. That company then pitches via webinar to our investment committee, 8 individuals that are volunteer basis spread across our footprint that have substantial investment experience. That pitch is about 20 minutes, and then there's 20 minutes of Q&A. At that point, we ask them to hop off and we make a decision. So we're doing that every single week, and we're making a funding decision every week. We're at about a 25 to 30% funding rate, and we're closing anywhere from 2 to 3 investments per month. About 3/4 of those are new companies, and 1/4 of those are follow-on. So that's kind of the picture, and a company gets approved, they're now getting dollars from our limited partner fund as well. So think of a typical company is raising anywhere from $200,000 to $500,000. We just got them $100,000 from those 2 funds, but there's still a gap. One of the really exciting things is we've had about 12 times our investment in co- and follow-on investment from outside investors, over 130 unique investors into those companies we've invested in. But there's still that gap that these companies are trying to raise. We've been requested for 30 times what we've been able to put out since 2016. So this investor network, which is this third piece, and sorry, I'm just taking a big circle back to the opportunity zones. The investor network allows us to share that investment opportunity with accredited investors who can come in for as little as $10,000. We'll structure that into a special purpose vehicle, so an LLC. So we'll aggregate all those interested parties into one LLC, so it's one line item on their capitalization table. Much more attractive for these companies. What we don't want is wonky capitalization tables, because that can scare off follow-on investors. And all we're doing there is just charging a flat fee, because we don't want to be a broker-dealer. So where opportunity zones come in, as I mentioned, 70% of our companies are in low-income census tracts. 40% of our companies are in opportunity zones. We originally thought, this is fantastic. Let's set up a captive fund to invest in companies. Well, we know that's not really possible with the regs, and this investor network actually fits perfectly for doing single asset special purpose vehicles. So now when an investor is looking at a company and they say, I'm interested, we'll denote that they're a qualified opportunity zone business. We can set up a separate SPV that is an opportunity fund, and then they can invest with capital gains alongside potentially non-capital gains as well. So now we're effectively giving them 4 sources of capital into the company. The one thing I'll note is our typical investment vehicle is a convertible debt note. Since you cannot use debt for the opportunity funds, it is restricted to preferred equity. But we are seeing now with our portfolio that those companies are graduating to call it later stage funding rounds where they typically would use preferred equity. So as far as what we're doing now with opportunity zones, we just launched this investor network about 2 weeks ago. We thought we would have one of our companies that would be a qualifying opportunity zone business. They are still finishing a convertible debt round, so we did not want to force them into a preferred equity round. But we're very optimistic that by October they will be in a position to be raising equity, in which case we can float them as our first opportunity zone business.